The air in Oakhaven had always held a certain stillness, a quiet so profound it felt as if the very trees held their breath. But lately, a different kind of stillness had settled, a heavy, suffocating silence that clung to the back of your throat. It began with the whispers, mere rustlings in the wind that no one could quite place, sounds that seemed to echo from a place far older and colder than Oakhaven itself. Then came the disappearances. It started small, a pet cat here, a stray dog there. Then a young man who'd gone out for a late-night stroll and never returned. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was etched with the worries of a small town, found himself fielding increasingly frantic calls. His deputies, seasoned men who'd seen their share of trouble, looked at him with a dawning unease. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, just an absence, an emptiness where life used to be. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I've lived in Oakhaven my entire life. I'm a librarian, a keeper of stories, and I've always been drawn to the forgotten corners of history, the tales that lurk in the shadows. It was in the dusty archives of the Oakhaven Historical Society, amidst brittle newspapers and faded photographs, that I first stumbled upon the threads of something ancient, something hungry. The old tales spoke of a creature, a shadow that stalked the fringes of the Whispering Woods, a place that even the most hardened hunters avoided. They called it the Gloom Weaver, a being of pure darkness, capable of unraveling the very fabric of existence. The legends were dismissed as folklore, bedtime stories to frighten children. But as the disappearances continued, as the silence in Oakhaven deepened, those old stories began to feel less like fiction and more like prophecy. I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, belonging to a Reverend Silas Blackwood, the town's first pastor. His entries were filled with a growing dread, a desperate attempt to chronicle the encroaching darkness. He wrote of unsettling dreams, of a chilling presence that seeped into the town like a toxic fog. He described a shift in the woods, a way the shadows themselves seemed to deepen, to move with an unnatural sentience. He mentioned strange markings, symbols etched into ancient trees, symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent light. One particularly chilling entry detailed a night when the moon was swallowed by clouds, a night of absolute darkness. He wrote of hearing a sound unlike any other, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the earth, a sound that promised oblivion. He described a fleeting glimpse of something colossal, something that defied description, a silhouette against the starless sky, its form amorphous and terrifying. He believed it was the Gloom Weaver, awakened from its slumber. As I delved deeper, piecing together fragmented accounts and local legends, a pattern emerged. The disappearances weren't random. They happened during periods of profound natural silence, when the birds stopped singing, when the wind died down, and an unnatural calm descended upon Oakhaven. It was as if the creature fed on that stillness, drawing sustenance from the absence of life's natural chaos. Sheriff Brody, desperate for answers, heard about my research. He came to the library one evening, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He confessed that his deputies were spooked, that the town was on the verge of panic. He admitted that the disappearances were beyond anything he'd ever encountered, that the lack of evidence was baffling and terrifying. He was willing to listen to anything, even the ramblings of an old librarian and forgotten myths. I shared the journal, the symbols, the growing sense of dread that permeated the old records. He listened intently, his skepticism battling with the stark reality of his failing investigation. We decided to investigate the Whispering Woods, a decision that felt both brave and incredibly foolish. We ventured into the woods as dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and blood orange. The silence here was absolute, a stark contrast to the usual symphony of rustling leaves and chirping insects. The air grew colder, biting at our exposed skin. The trees, ancient and gnarled, seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The shadows beneath them weren't merely the absence of light. They possessed a depth, a palpable density that seemed to absorb sound and warmth. We found one of the markings Reverend Blackwood had described, a complex, swirling symbol etched into the bark of an ancient oak. As we approached, the air around it seemed to shimmer, to distort. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, a sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by something far more ancient and indifferent. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, but a deep, resonant thrumming that emanated from the earth itself. The trees swayed violently, though there was no wind. A low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, echoed through the silent woods. It was the sound Reverend Blackwood had described, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. Sheriff Brody drew his firearm, his hand trembling. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting a weak swath through the encroaching darkness. And then we saw it. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood, not in any conventional sense. It was a distortion, a void that seemed to drink the light. It moved with a fluid, unsettling grace, its form shifting and reforming like smoke. It was impossibly large, its silhouette eclipsing the trees, its presence a crushing weight on our senses. It was pure shadow, a living embodiment of the deepest night, the gloom weaver. Its form was a tapestry of darkness, shifting and coalescing, impossibly vast. Tendrils of shadow, like grasping hands, reached out from its amorphous mass, extending towards us. The air grew frigid, the very molecules of oxygen seemingly being drawn into its oppressive aura. The growl intensified, a symphony of despair that vibrated through our bones. Sheriff Brody fired, the bullets disappearing into the swirling darkness without effect. The creature didn't flinch. It seemed to regard us with an ancient, terrifying indifference, like a child contemplating an ant. Then it moved. Not with speed, but with an inevitable creeping advance. The shadows around us coalesced, forming pathways of deeper darkness that converged upon us. I felt a chilling dread, a primal fear that threatened to paralyze me. This was not a monster to be fought, but a force of nature to be survived, if survival was even possible. The creature's form began to solidify, to take on a more defined, though still horrifying shape. What appeared to be a gaping maw, a vortex of swirling darkness, opened within its mass. A sense of utter despair, of utter hopelessness washed over me. It wasn't just consuming physical matter, it was consuming hope, consuming joy, consuming life itself. The silence in Oakhaven was its hunting ground, its sanctuary. The disappearances weren't abductions, they were dissolutions. The unfortunate souls being absorbed into the very essence of this primordial entity. The symbols in the woods were not just markings, they were conduits, anchors that tethered this creature to our world. As the gloom weaver's form loomed closer, I remembered a passage from Reverend Blackwood's journal, a desperate plea, a last resort. He wrote of a specific frequency, a sound that could disrupt the creature's coherence, a sound that could drive it back into the void from which it came. He described it as a high-pitched, resonant tone, a sound of pure, unadulterated light. I didn't have a sonic device, nothing that could produce such a sound, but I had my voice. It was a desperate, insane thought, but in that moment of absolute terror, it was the only thought I had. I began to sing. It wasn't a song of defiance or a plea for mercy. It was a simple, pure lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me, a melody of innocence and peace. I poured every ounce of my being into it, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as I focused on the pure, bright notes. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The gloom weaver recoiled. The swirling darkness around its maw seemed to stutter. The guttural growl faltered, replaced by a discordant shriek, a sound of agony and confusion. The tendrils of shadow writhed and retracted. Sheriff Brody, understanding dawning in his eyes, joined in, his deep baritone adding a grounding layer to my soprano. The combined sound, my pure, clear notes and his steady voice, created a resonance that seemed to push back against the oppressive darkness. The creature contorted, its form flickering like a faulty light bulb. The symbols on the trees pulsed erratically, as if overloaded. The woods, which had been unnaturally silent, began to stir. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant chirping of crickets could be heard. The oppressive cold began to recede. With a final, ear-splitting shriek that seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of reality, the Gloomweaver imploded. It didn't explode, but rather collapsed in on itself, a vortex of darkness rapidly shrinking until it was no more than a pinpoint of absolute blackness, which then vanished, leaving behind only the rustling of leaves and the returning symphony of the night. We stood there, panting, hearts pounding in our chests, the echoes of the creature's final shriek still ringing in our ears. The woods, no longer a place of suffocating dread, felt lighter. The oppressive stillness had broken. Sheriff Brody looked at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. How did you know?" I could only shake my head, my voice still hoarse. Reverend Blackwood, he believed sound, the sound of life, of joy, could counteract its power. We returned to Oakhaven, the town still shrouded in a tense silence, the disappearances a fresh wound. But something had shifted. The heavy dread that had permeated the air had begun to lift. The next morning, a few of the missing pets reappeared on their doorsteps, disoriented but unharmed. Then, a week later, young Thomas Miller, who had vanished weeks ago, was found wandering near the edge of the woods, dazed but alive. He had no memory of what had happened, only a vague sense of overwhelming fear and darkness. The Gloomweaver was gone, at least for now. But the legend remained, etched into the collective memory of Oakhaven. The Whispering Woods became a place spoken of in hushed tones, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The story of the creature, the shadow that stalked the night, was no longer just a folktale. It was a truth, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of our perception, a darkness that could be held at bay by the simple, profound power of light, of life, and of the human voice singing its song of defiance. The tale of the Gloomweaver, the monster that nearly consumed Oakhaven, became an icon, a chilling reminder of what lies hidden in the quiet places, waiting to be awakened. And sometimes, when the wind rustles through the leaves of the Whispering Woods and the silence descends just a little too deeply, I swear I can still hear a faint, distant hum, a whisper from the void, reminding us that even the most terrifying shadows can be banished, if only by the courage to shine a light.